Willful Blindness, how a network of narcos, tycoons, and CCP agents infiltrated the West. Now, China is demanding a rewriting of international norms, attempting to create a new international order in which the rule of law is manipulated, human dignity is debased, democracy is abused, and justice denied. I was born and grew up in China. I still have a Chinese passport. My academic research and activism focus on human rights, justice, and politics in China. I've dedicated and sacrificed a lot for a better China. I'm against the Chinese Communist Party. I support sanctioning Chinese corrupt officials and human rights abusers. I participated in the fight for human rights and freedom of the Uyghurs, Tibetans, and Hong Kongers. I proposed more scrutiny on the CCP operations in the West, such as the Confucius Institutes, the Gongos, and the propaganda media outlets, all directed by United Front Works Department operations linked to consulates around the globe. It is ridiculous to claim that criticizing the Chinese government is part of the racist narrative of anti-China or anti-Chinese. To a great extent, to love China or the Chinese people requires those outside of China to oppose the Chinese government or the CCP. Teng Biao. But how did Canada become a haven for drug cash fleeing China? The Chinese government enacted strict controls limiting the export of foreign currency from China. But numerous families of Chinese officials and their business associates transferred such enormous quantities of money to Canada. For so many Chinese Communist officials' families who have acquired this real estate in Vancouver and throughout Canada, the provenance of the vast amounts of Canadian dollars they have used to pay for is unclear. Especially as their Lamborghini and Ferrari lifestyles far exceed the range of their legitimate, modest government salaries. But the relationship between the Communist Party and triad criminals at all levels, domestically and abroad, are well established. Charles Burton. Welcome to the global launch of Sam Cooper's book, Wilful Blindness. We have people from all over the globe with us today, from Australia to Germany, Hong Kong to South Africa, at all points in between. I first became aware of Sam and his reporting on Patrick Brown, who was questioning why Premier Wynne, the Liberals, were then awarding contracts to a company that seemed to have questionable business model. According to reports by Cooper and Global News, they were allowing patrons to show up with duffel bags full of cash. Reportedly, on one occasion, 1.2 million in neatly wrapped 20s. Former BC gaming minister Rich Coleman testified at the Cullen Commission recently that we should not question where the money came from and that using cash from wealthy Asian gamblers was a cultural preference. Besides, BC Lottery had some of the best practices in the world on knowing their customers. Now that seems to be in question. Willful Blindness is a much bigger study on how the CCP, tycoons, and narcos infiltrated Canada. It's about national security. According to the National Security and Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians, headed by Liberal David McGuinty, there are now 14 TNOC groups that pose a threat to national security. 14. It was less than 5 years ago. The same report suggests that 800 billion to 2 trillion US is laundered each year around the globe, and Canada punches well above its weight, laundering as much as up to 100 billion Canadian a year. More troubling is that Markham is the operational center for one of the biggest TNOC operations in the world, named Sam Gore. Sam will address this and a lot more today in our launch. First, I'd like to say that and thank for many people who put this event together today and for their support. We have a distinguished group of panelists with us today that will address 3 topics, which I will introduce throughout the event. All those wishing to ask questions, you can post them in the live stream. We have already received a number of questions to ask our panel today. Willful Blindness is available in Canada through Indigo chapters and independent booksellers. The hardcover is almost sold out, so get your orders in today. This is because of COVID. Obviously, all suppliers are having difficulties getting books into market, but be patient. They will be shipped out, or you can pick them up from the various stores, Indigo and independent booksellers. Our panel consists of Ivy Lee, who is in Calgary, Dr. Charles Burton, who's in the Niagara region, Dr. Teng Biao, who's in Princeton, New Jersey, and Benedict Rogers comes to you from London, England. The star of the event, though, Sam Cooper, he's in Ottawa today. So grab your favorite beverage and enjoy the launch of Wilful, Blindness, how a network of narcos, tycoons, and CCP agents infiltrated the West. So let me start today by introducing Sam Cooper. Sam is an award-winning Canadian journalist, cited as one of Canada's top investigative reporters. He joined the Vancouver province in 2009, where he started to investigate political corruption and real estate money laundering in Vancouver. He won a National Newspaper Award, NNA, for a team project including his story exposing the cover of elder abuse in BC care homes, and was part of the NNA-nominated series Racism in Paradise, which explored social cohesion and challenges with racism in British Columbia. Cooper joined the Vancouver Sun in 2016, where he broke numerous stories on money laundering and casinos. In 2017, his e-pirate story won the Jack Webster Award for Journalism. He has now filed more than 60 exclusive stories on the widening scandal, most recently exposing ties between organized crime and state actors in Toronto and Vancouver. After relocating to Ottawa, Cooper and his global news colleague, John Huey, won the Jack Webster 2019 Excellence in Feature Enterprise Reporting Television for their submission, Casino Diaries. In just a moment, Sam is going to do a reading, but first of all, I will introduce the first topic of the day, and that is, everyone has heard about the United Front Works Department. We're going to talk about their secret weapon. So by doing that, what I'd like to do first is to introduce Dr. Teng Biao and also Ivy Lee, and then Sam will do a reading. Dr. Teng Biao is an academic lawyer, currently Grove Human Rights Scholar at Hunter College. He co-founded two human rights NGOs in Beijing, the Open Constitution Initiative and the China Against the Death Penalty. He is one of the earliest promoters of the rights defense movement in China and the Manifesto Charter 08, which Dr. Liao Zibo was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. His research includes human rights, criminal justice, social movement, and political transition in China. Teng is working on two books. One is on China's human rights movement and another on China's threat to global human rights and freedom. He is now a Posen visiting professor, University of Chicago, Grove Human Rights Scholar, Hunter College. And now Ivy Lee was born and raised in Hong Kong. She also studied in the US and worked in Hong Kong, the US, and Canada. Having lived in many places, including Hong Kong, Virginia, Louisiana, Iowa, New York, Ontario, British Columbia, and Alberta, Ivy has experienced and observed how tensions often arise from cultural misunderstandings and value differences, and how those tensions could easily be exploited. Ivy is a former design professor at Sheridan College and a co-founder of Ontario's first honors Bachelor of Design degree program in visual communication at York University Sheridan College Honors Bachelor of Design program. Ivy co-chaired the Graphic Design Accreditations Committee in Ontario and is a founding member of the Association of Registered Graphic Designers of Ontario. She is also the lead designer on the first Chinese New Year stamp in Canada. As a professional and an educator, Ivy specializes in information design and visual communication. Her interest is in analyzing the integrity and information structuring and presenting inevitability carries over to her activism. Ivy's involvement in the pro-democracy movement is long. She was a board member of the Toronto Association for Democracy of China for many years and became the founding member of Vancouver Friends of Hong Kong. After she moved to Vancouver, when Vancouver Friends of Hong Kong expanded to become Canadian Friends of Hong Kong, Ivy remains to be a core member and one of those spokespersons. Sam, if you'd like to lead off with a reading from Wilful, Blindness. Thank you.
Thanks, Dean, and thanks for publishing this book. It has been a real journey. So I'll read from the chapter called Strike Back Hard. On May 2nd, a petition demanding the retraction of my United Front PPE story started circulating on WeChat groups across Canada. My colleague Jeremy Nuttall, a Toronto Star investigative reporter with strong connections in the Chinese-Canadian community, spotted the petition first. "I'm not going to share this nonsense," Nuttall wrote on Twitter, "but it's a typical tactic from the Chinese Communist Party to try to shut Canadians up when they criticize the regime in Beijing." The petition and a deluge of similar statements in Chinese language media claimed my story had lumped all Chinese Canadians into the United Front PPE operation and that this was racist. But Nuttall was right. The petition was nonsense. My story was based on facts, evidence, and direct quotes from official Chinese sources. The story explained that Beijing is trying to control and use all Chinese immigrants abroad. This has been extensively supported by numerous intelligence reports and books like Claws of the Panda and Hidden Hand. But I had to respond to politically motivated attacks on my story. It wasn't hard to identify the hand of Beijing. Fortunately, I had a lot of assistance from sources in the Chinese and Hong Kong Canadian communities. And my sources found the petition and many derivative media posts mirrored statements coming from China's government. It was so elegantly logical, a perfect circle of United Front activity. The media commentaries and Chinese government statements denouncing my story were published by the same websites that China had used to publicize the PPE operations in Canada. These were, of course, the very same media websites that I had monitored to document United Front meetings involving e-pirate money laundering suspects. The same sites that showed RCMP suspects frequently meeting with Chinese consulate officials and Canadian politicians. As these waves of media disinformation washed over me day after day, one of my sources, a Chinese-Canadian academic, monitored the evidence. My source assessed that Beijing was behind the attacks. The situation was surreal. I was losing sleep. I spent nights talking to sources in intelligence. These experts came to the same conclusion as the Chinese-Canadian academic. As reporters, we never want to become part of the story, but I couldn't avoid it. I had poked at Beijing's PPE networks and exposed deep organized crime connections. Now, the communications section of this coiled snake was writhing and striking back. In fact, "strike back hard" was the exact phrase used by a key figure. Aside from his media gig, this broadcaster, Omni TV columnist Ding Guo, leads a society active in lobbying Canadian politicians on issues that align with Beijing's interests in Canada, much like many of Ding's columns. As an example of the society's activity, one source forwards screen captures from Ding Guo's May 2020 Zoom chat with a pro-Beijing Canadian senator, in which the senator presented a not-for-circulation insider's analysis of the Canadian government's, quote, response to the COVID-19 health crisis and the politics of COVID-19. So before I throw it over to Tun, I will say, I think it's fair comment. I'll identify that the pro-Beijing senator referenced is Senator Yuan Paowu. And I think in the recent weeks, he filed an opinion editorial in a Vancouver newspaper in which he attacked the Chinese-Canadian researcher, Andy Yan, who has been at the forefront of digging into very opaque transfers from offshore and analyzing how global money, most specifically money from mainland China, has influenced Vancouver's real estate market. I do think it's emblematic that Senator Wu stepped forward in the recent weeks to launch an attack on Mr. Yan, who is a leading Canadian academic and analyst. And the meaning of that attack, the implication, and the motivation is something that perhaps we should discuss on this panel. So over to you, Tun.
Thank you very much, Sam, for your wonderful book, and thank you, Dean, for your introduction. So first thing I want to say is being against the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, is not racism. Anti-CCP is not anti-China. And I repeat my words you have seen in the video. To be a great extent to love China or the Chinese people needs to oppose the Chinese government or the CCP. And people like Sam Cooper and many Chinese watchers and scholars, they sacrificed a lot, and they dedicated their time, their career to studying China, and they love China and they love Chinese people, but they have to tell the truth, and they are opposing the Chinese government, not China. And I have many experience, like my scheduled talk was cancelled by Ivy League University. Like my panel was cancelled by Columbia University because the Chinese Students and Scholars Association threatened to protest against our panel discussion. And many other organizations like CSSA and Chamber of Commerce, alumni associations, townsmen associations, and under the umbrella of United Front Work Department. And I have students who are afraid of registering my class or afraid of going to my talk. And I also received death threats online and being intimidated and harassed by the people sent by the Chinese government. And recently and my whole family were harassed by the former spy Guo Wengui. And many of our panelists are concerned about the experience of Professor Anne Manny Brady. Her office and her home were broken into, and her cartels were sabotaged because of her wonderful work on the United Front work. And an American citizen like Samuel Chu was on the red notice by the Chinese government. And we should notice that the Article 38 of the Hong Kong's national security law actually targets everyone in the world. If one criticizes Beijing in terms of Hong Kong policy or advocates Hong Kong democracy, Hong Kong independence, he or she might be targeted by that national security law. And we know that Chinese secret police kidnapped Gui Minhai, a Swedish publisher in Thailand, and Gui was sent back to China and tortured and forced to give up his Chinese citizenship, and then he was given 10-year imprisonment. So it's very important for countries like the United States and Canada to remain open to the world, to welcome people from different culture, religions, and political systems. But that definitely doesn't mean a country should become a safe haven for money laundering, corruption, or human trafficking. And an open society must not be exploited by the dictatorial regime like CCP to monitor the diaspora communities and to spread its anti-democracy propaganda. So the Chinese Communist Party has been a direct and urgent threat to global freedom and democracy. So I think facing the truth and stopping the appeasement policy are among the first steps. I'll pass on to Ivy.
Thank you, Dr. Teng Biao. Sam's book has special meaning for me for two reasons. I lived in Vancouver for a long time. Sam's book links together everything that I had witnessed and reveal the terrifying truth.
Can you hear you
now?
Yeah.
Can you hear me now? Okay.
Yeah.
Sam's book has special meaning for me for two reasons. I lived in Vancouver for a long time. Sam's book links together everything that I had witnessed and revealed the terrifying truth without any holding back. And I'm a Hong Kong Canadian. The CCP considers all ethnic Chinese belong to the regime, regardless of our nationalities and where we live. CCP sees all ethnic Chinese as tools to be manipulated and to be controlled, and can be destroyed at will if we dare to stand in this way. Sam's book made it crystal clear how much CCP's United Front work has taken control of Chinese community groups and infiltrated the upper levels of Canadian society in order to advance its interests and to erode our democracy. The psychological warfare that United Front work has waged on Sam by accusing him being racist is a classic example of how CCP controls the narratives in Canada. To fight the Canada model and real racism, we need to take down the racist card. We need to be able to distinguish a racist card from a real racist act. CCP psychological warfare on ethnic Chinese community is, you are defenseless without a strong motherland, and only CCP can give you a strong motherland. Therefore, you need a strong CCP. CCP's psychological warfare on non-ethnic Chinese Canadians is, you're racist, you're colonialist, you're imperialist. Chinese, represented by the CCP, are your victims. Here's an example of how successful United Front works racist and victimhood cards are. While Canadian politicians and community leaders earnestly pushing for a Nanjing Massacre Memorial Day, with the full endorsement of the Chinese consulate, not one single Canadian politician uttered a word about a Tiananmen Massacre Memorial Day. To take down CCP's racist and victimhood cards, we need to recognize the following facts. Firstly, many ethnic Chinese Canadians have excelled in our society and in our career due to our own talents, abilities, and hard work. Our successes have nothing to do with whether there is a strong China or not. For an ethnic Chinese Canadian to believe that he or she can only stand tall and be respected if there is a strong motherland, is essentially saying that I, as an individual, cannot stand up for myself and must depend on someone else, even if that someone else is a murderous dictator. This is the most degrading thought we could have on ourselves as independent and free person. Secondly, the Chinese public should take credit that it is our individual and collective ability to self-reflect and self-examine in our pursuit of the democratic ideal of equality and fairness that have gradually reduced the degree of severity of blatant racism in the last few decades. We should have confidence that with perseverance, we will be able to tackle racism together without subscribing to CCP's spins. United Front wants us to be afraid of having backlash to the Chinese community if we criticize anything that is Chinese or China. And many of our politicians gladly making use of that fear as an excuse to evade urgently needed discussions or actions. Suppressing legitimate discussions will only increase resentments and angers among the public. United Front work knows that, and their racist and victimhood cards are aiming at increasing that tension in order to increase the fear of the ethnic Chinese community, therefore to increase their sense of dependency on a strong CCP-led motherland. The best way to counter that is to have critical discussions and examinations of the issues with a goal to separate the racist card portion from the real racist portion. The ethnic Chinese community and the media can play a critical role in this. Sunshine is the best disinfectant. We need to free ourselves from the Canada model and CCP's manipulations by putting everything on the table, as what Sam has very bravely done with Wilful, Blindness. Thank you.
Thanks so much for those comments, Ivy, and it means a lot to me because I'm not sure that many people realize. They might have the impression that I get all my facts and scoops hanging out with law enforcement or intelligence types and encrypted communications, but really I think I started this journey in Vancouver by speaking to a lot of people in the Chinese Canadian and Hong Kong community. And it's the same for smart people in Ottawa that understand the networks that I'm looking at. They get most of their best information from the Chinese Canadian and Hong Kong Canadian community. If I can say, I think I'm very encouraged by early commentary on my book. It seems to be that people are saying that they like to read it because it's written for the everyday person that might enjoy a crime novel, might enjoy a bit of geopolitics, might enjoy some stories of corruption, but this really wraps it together in a way that I was chasing facts on the ground and putting things together. And really, I always have to come back to this point. I was following the money. In this case, I found it was dirty money. It wasn't my intention to stumble in and discover what the United Front Work Department was, or try to understand who could be a Ministry of State security agent in British Columbia or in Ottawa. But I think the revelation of this book is I found that the people that were facilitating bags of $20 bills up to 1.2 million coming into a casino per night with one whale gambler. These were the very same people that were interacting with people in the Vancouver Chinese consulate, top level leaders. They were interacting with Canadian politicians, and the photos told the story. This is United Front activity. And I followed it. I wouldn't let the story go. And I have to say, I do think that I took my motivation to another level when I discovered that the people who are associated with the e-pirate, largest ever casino money laundering investigation in Canada, I found that associates of these transnational criminals were in the crowd that surrounded a church building of Hong Kong Canadians. Same people were involved, allegedly in harassing a Uyghur activist outside of an event that was run by what we're told is the controlling level United Front Work Department group in Canada on the West Coast. So Ivy and Tun, I appreciate your comments because you are the type of experts that really my journey of discovery started with in some ways.
Thank you, Sam. Thank you, Teng, and thank you, Ivy. One of the things that I think that really highlights, Sam and I have talked a lot about his book over the last couple of years, and what was been fascinating to me is exactly what Sam is talking about. The fact that he wasn't interested in becoming part of the story, but he got pulled into the story in such a way that made him really involved to such a great extent. And I do some work with a number of people and the China Democracy Foundation to protect academics and journalists. And what's important is that you work with experts from around the world. These are people from China. These are people from Hong Kong. These are people from Myanmar and other destinations on human rights. The stories are the same. The Chinese government does have a penchant for oppressing and suppressing free speech, and civil and human rights wherever they happen to operate, and they do it here in Canada as well. So with that, Sam, I don't know if you had any further comments on that, or if we'd like to move on to the next topic. I'm
fine to move on to the money topic.
On to the money topic. always follow the money. And I think that's what Sam did at the end of the day. And this is really important. And I'm going to introduce Ben Rogers in a moment. Our second topic is really talks about red financing and money laundering as a global enterprise. A lot of money coming out of Hong Kong that entered all countries throughout the world. Canada is not unique in that regard. London is another place where a lot of investment has gone, and that's where we find Mr. Rogers today. Mr. Rogers is a human rights activist and writer based in London. He is the author of 6 books, including Burma, A Nation at the Crossroads. He's also a former parliamentary candidate and co-founder and deputy chair of the Conservative Party Human Rights Commission in the UK. Ben has lived in Hong Kong from 1997 to 2002 and travels regularly to the region, although not so much these days. He is co-founder and chief executive of Hong Kong Watch. He's a senior analyst for the East Asia Human Rights Organization, CSW, and an advisor to the Inter-Parliamentary Alliance on China, IPAC, and the Stop Uyghur Genocide Campaign, and deputy chair of the UK Conservative Party Human Rights Commission. I bid further ado to my colleague, Ben Rogers.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Dean, and it's a great privilege to be with you at this really important event. And I want to start by congratulating very warmly Sam Cooper and Optimum Publishing for this really excellent and important and courageous book. If you want to look at the full damage that Beijing's economic coercion can do, Hong Kong is the best example. To understand Hong Kong's recent political transformation and the almost total dismantling of its freedoms, autonomy and rule of law in flagrant violation of an international treaty, you need to understand Hong Kong's economy and how it's changed. You need to, as Dean has said, follow the money. The huge influx of mainland Chinese money and assets, what we call red capital, into Hong Kong, combined with the increased dependency of many international firms on Chinese markets, has meant that when Beijing made the endorsement of its draconian national security law, which it imposed on Hong Kong almost a year ago, when it made that a red line issue for businesses, the majority of businesses fell into line. Mainland firms now make up 60% of the Hong Kong stock market, and increasingly they provide a model for their Western and local Hong Kong competitors for how to curry favor with Beijing. International firms are faced with the unpleasant choice of whether to follow their principles and risk economic punishment or kowtow. Cathay Pacific, for example, was almost forced into bankruptcy when some of their employees attended protests in 2019. And that shows the dangers for firms who have already made themselves dependent on access to CCP-run China. The influx of red capital touches on every sphere of life. The media in Hong Kong is now more or less universally controlled by pro-CCP vested interests. As Jimmy Lai, who now sits in prison and just a week ago saw his assets frozen, and he hasn't even been convicted yet under the national security law charges, we see the last leading pro-democracy media outlet in Hong Kong in jeopardy, not because it doesn't have readers, but because of economic coercion. Red firms instruct employees on how to vote or not to attend protests. Employees who fail to toe the party line in companies in Hong Kong lose their jobs. Hong Kong is the starkest example, but it is far from the only place where red capital is shifting power dynamics. The British government should be alarmed that a British bank, HSBC, has so publicly undermined the UK's foreign policy objectives by siding with the Chinese government. Beijing's stranglehold over powerful vested interests in the City of London further hinders a coherent UK-China policy. It's illustrated in many examples, but just one, recent remarks by Catherine McGuinness, the policy chief at the City of London Corporation, who said that it was, quote, not our place to criticize the Chinese government for human rights violations and that we need to look at business connections. The European Union faces similar dilemmas. Following the mass sell-off of public assets in the Mediterranean during the Eurozone crisis, Chinese state-owned enterprises have bought up large amounts of strategic infrastructure, whether that's in Greece, Portugal, Cyprus, or beyond. Hong Kong shows how red capital is frequently co-opted for political united front ends. The EU Comprehensive Agreement on Investment, which incidentally the European Parliament has voted to suspend further discussion of just today, but if it were to pass, although it looks less likely now, it would strengthen the hand of mainland firms in Europe and increase strategic dependency, weakening the ability of European states to act autonomously if Beijing crosses further lines in Hong Kong, in Xinjiang, or in Taiwan. So Canada is far from the only context where these trends are evident, but the wider context, as I've outlined, shows why this book is so important in illustrating these issues, and it should be read very widely. Thank you very much.
I'm just going to come in and make some comments now on Ben and further this particular topic.
Thanks, Ben. Yes, again, for me in writing Wilful Blindness, illustrating these high-level financial and geopolitical issues for let's just say the mainstream reader was one of my goals. So you've illustrated how red capital is leveraged and legitimate transnational corporations. We have seen what happened to the NBA when an executive made an offhand, it seems, comment supporting democracy in Hong Kong, and the NBA very nearly lost a good chunk of its business, and that can happen to any corporation. That's one side of the picture. What I stumbled into again, and I always say stumble because I was just trying to figure out why were real estate prices moving the way they were in Vancouver. I know cities like London have similar issues, maybe more related to transnational crime in other countries, let's say Russia in some cases, the Middle East. But it's important for citizens wherever they live to understand how your real estate, homes are an essential item for families. This is the bedrock of nations. So we need to understand the relationship between the real economy and the underground economy. This is something that's come up in the Cullen Commission. We heard a panelist say that when dirty money comes in, it chases the good money out. And so we try to put a handle on how big is that chunk of dirty money. People ask me that question all the time. So I'll say that when we're looking at legitimate casinos, illegal casinos in British Columbia, my estimation is from $2 to $3 billion has been laundered going back to the late 90s. My book, for the readers, there's a very detailed history of how Macau-style money laundering came in with the game of Baccarat in the 1990s, how the triad leaders came in at the same time, how it was related to geopolitical events in Hong Kong, Macau, and Beijing. How big is the real estate money laundering in Vancouver, and what impact does it have? How does it relate to trade-based money laundering, which is an even bigger portion, and I would argue even more connected to high-level politics than real estate and casino money laundering? In Vancouver, Dean, at the start of this event, you have said that in Canada, it's estimated up to $100 billion per year is laundered across the country, and Canada is punching above its weight in a way. I estimate tens of billions of dollars in real estate money laundering is a good conservative estimate in the city of Vancouver. But Toronto, we shouldn't fool ourselves that Vancouver is far ahead of Toronto in money laundering. My more recent investigations that made it into Wilful Blindness do show how underground banking related to Iran, mainland China, and the Middle East is a huge issue in Toronto. So I really do think it's important that as Canadians, world citizens, we get a better handle around how much money is being laundered through real estate, how it relates to the movement of drug money and the leveraging of capital flight in nations such as Iran and China, and how that impacts everyday citizens that are paying their taxes and trying to afford homes, trying to save up to send their children to university.
Thank you, Ben and Sam, for getting into that topic in such a great way. I think that the capital and the flight of that capital out of Hong Kong and its movement around the world obviously has created significant investment opportunities. And legitimate ones as well, as you mentioned. But what we don't know is some of the provenance of all of that capital as it's entered various countries throughout the world. So moving on to our next topic now, I'd like to take the time to introduce Dr. Charles Burton. And Dr. Burton wrote the foreword for Wilful, Blindness. He also wrote the foreword for Hidden Hand by Clive Hamilton and Mareki Oldberg, also published by Optimum, and there's a lot of connections between the two books. Charles is a senior fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, Center for Advancing Canada's Interests Abroad. He's a non-resident fellow at the European Value Center for Security Policy, Department of Political Science at Brock University, specializing in comparative politics, government, and politics of China, Canada-China relations, and human rights. In 1989 to 2020, he was counselor at the Canadian Embassy to China between 1991 and 93, and 1998 to 2000. Previously, he worked at the Communications Security Establishment of the Canadian Department of National Defence. He has a PhD from the University of Toronto after studies at Cambridge University Oriental Studies and Fudan University History of Ancient Chinese Thought Program, a Department of Philosophy class of 77. He has also published extensively on China and North Korea affairs and China relations, and has been commissioned to write reports on matters relating to China's relations with China for agencies of the Government of Canada. Charles is a frequent commentator on Chinese affairs in newspapers, radio, and television throughout North America. Charles?
Well, thank you very much, Dean. This is the last segment of this book launch, and I'd like to talk about the willful blindness element. And, you know, Teng Biao talked about a lot of things that the Chinese regime has done that seem to be ignored by Western governments. And then Ivy talked about this issue of aspersions of racism, which is very concerning, I think, to all of us. But I think the main willful blindness is to the nature of the PRC regime. You know, there's a desire to pretend that Chinese communist institutions are equivalent to Canadian institutions, whereas really the PRC regime is an integrated party, state, military, security, industrial complex. As Mao Zedong put it, party, government, military, civilian, and academic, east, west, south, north, and center, the party leads everything. And this principle has been explicitly reemphasized by Xi Jinping and codified into the constitution of the Chinese Communist Party. So really all mainland institutions, whether they're government institutions, party institutions, or claim to be non-government institutions, they're all subject to the unified leadership of the party and coordinated to further the overall interests of power of the Chinese Communist Party. And so China's party, state, military, security, industrial complex seeks to further its strategic interests in Canada and other Western nations through a purposive policy of dissembling and subversion. Ivy talked about how Chinese Canadians are subject to menace and intimidation. The PRC regime insists that anybody of Han Chinese ethnicity, as descendants of the Yellow Emperor, must do whatever the Chinese Communist Party asks of them to further the agenda of the PRC motherland here in Canada, even if that means breaking Canadian law or violating the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So this puts, is a awful aspersion onto the character of ethnic Chinese who have absolutely nothing to do with the Chinese Communist Party, that somehow or other Canadian mainstream believes that they are acting as agents for malign activities by this regime. It's, most awful sort of racism to impose that onto persons here in Canada who have come to Canada for our freedom and democracy. The essence of the Chinese Communist Party's United Front work is in fact to induce elements, non-communist elements, to support the interests of the Chinese Communist Party. And Chairman Mao and General Secretary Xi have referred to the United Front work as the Chinese Communist Party's magic weapon, Fabao in Chinese, or treasure of the Dharma as it is literally. The PRC has a lot of files on really all of us, whether you're of Han ethnicity or simply people who are to their attention, or people who were downloaded when 25 million personnel files were downloaded from sources in the U.S. government. And based on facial recognition and other sophisticated artificial intelligence surveillance techniques, these files are cross-referenced in massive databases. So the idea that the PRC diplomats that Sam shows as being photographed with triad leaders triad leaders engaged in criminal activities like drug smuggling, like money laundering, don't know exactly who these people are and what they do is just absurd. They know. In terms of the overall strategy, China urges democratic foreign governments like Canada's to adopt a policy of appeasement to PRC regime aggression, as Teng Biao referred to in his remarks. This is really through a tactical discourse of setting aside differences and seeking common ground, qiu tong cun yi in Chinese language. What it amounts to is that Canada should ignore a wide range of concerns about Chinese regime behavior in favor of a promise by the Chinese regime of enhanced access to the Chinese market and reduction of Chinese non-tariff barriers to fair and reciprocal trade. And so we're supposed to ignore the espionage and interference operations by Chinese agents in Canada, and the fact that these are largely targeted towards persons of ethnic Chinese origin suggests that our government feels that they don't need to defend Canadians of Chinese origin to the extent as those of European origin. That we should ignore our security concerns over Chinese state acquisition of critical Canadian enterprises or Chinese state-associated firms like Huawei controlling the Canadian telecommunications through the 5G technology, or that we should ignore China's domestic policies of genocide and other violations of UN human rights covenants, including in Hong Kong, as Ben pointed out, that we should ignore China's expansion of territorial claims in the South China Sea and elsewhere, that we should ignore China's military menace of Taiwan, and China's engagement with the third world through the debt trap diplomacy and other abuses of international security laws, norms through the Belt and Road Initiative. Accepting this bargain that we separate our relations out, that our government show leadership and ignore Canadian public opinion, is justified by the pro-China Canadians who benefit personally from PRC sources as they put it, taking a long-term approach, having a nuanced, subtle, sophisticated and mature perspective on Canada-China relations. But what it really amounts to is a betrayal of Canada's sovereignty, security, and the Canadian values that make our country so great. There is a powerful pro-PRC lobby in Ottawa and Vancouver and other Canadian capitals, mostly retired politicians who are on China-related boards, including Canadian companies and law firms that benefit from their dealings with the PRC. If these people take the PRC money or indirectly associated PRC money, it is naturally expected that they will support the interests of the PRC in Canada in return. Beijing seems confident that once Canadian public outrage fades over China's shameless flouting of the norms of international relations, that the Canadians who are on this PRC gravy train will continue to successfully, quietly lobby the Canadian government not to implement any measures that would inhibit the expansion of China's influence in Canada. So, you know, no foreign agent registry or Foreign Influence Transparency Act scheme for Canada. Basically, the United Front work is a sophisticated engagement of Canada, and the PRC always seems to end up on top. Hopefully, Sam's book will open up a lot of Canadian eyes to what is really going on. So let me turn it back to Sam for some comments on that aspect.
Thanks, Charles. And your commentary reminded me again of my chapter, Strike Back Hard. So I'll run a few anecdotes by you and ask you if it fits into that United Front activity in which the party uses people that would not see themselves as agents of the party. However, they may have been leveraged in some way by this pro-PRC lobby to act against critics of the regime, as Mr. Nuttall said in the reading that I did earlier. So my chapter lays out how some of the actors that I had identified as being very close to the RCMP high-level organized crime suspects, very interrelated with Chinese consulate officials. I, again, through my Chinese Canadian sources that have access to Zoom chats and WeChat networks, received screen captures and transcriptions of secret meetings in which people decided to roll out the idea of quote-unquote crowdfunding a lawsuit against my PPE story or against my reporting in general. I think some people, maybe in Beijing, were wondering why the persistence in trying to dig into this shadowy underground banking and the related actors. So to jump to the point here, one of my colleagues, Bob Mackin, discovered that a Liberal MP's office was used in such a way that a WeChat group was posted to the office's website where there was a call out for crowdfunding donations to get this lawsuit effort going against myself. Again, I don't want to make myself part of the story. I do think it's very illustrative of what I see as United Front activity. So let me ask the question, and maybe I'll go to another example. For a Liberal MP's office to be used in a WeChat channel that sought to raise funds against a Canadian journalist, is that an example of the United Front trying to use associates that may not think of themselves as party operatives, but who become leveraged or potentially used in such a way?
Well, I think that, you know, really when Richard Fadden, the former director of CSIS, revealed that CSIS had concerns about senior Canadian politicians at the provincial and federal level who were under the influence of the Chinese regime, that he said that, you know, those people are not really to blame. It's the Chinese regime that's to blame. So I think that a lot of the Canadians who become complicit in acting as de facto agents for Chinese interests in Canada have been the subject of a very long-term, sophisticated engagement where they're gradually drawn into it, and by the time they realize, what's expected of them, it's really too late to get out. And so I think that the Canadians are obviously informed by a degree of naivete and also greed. And the Chinese United Front Work Department is very sophisticated in manipulating that and getting those people to start acting on behalf of the Chinese regime. And when it gets down to things like crowdfunding campaigns against Sam Cooper, they find themselves forced to go along with this when really it violates Canadian principles of honesty and free debate. And I would finally just say that that the China Democracy Fund that Dean is chairman of is designed to try and provide funds for people who are being subject to lawfare by PRC associated lawsuits to defend themselves against this kind of lawfare, so that people will not be cowed into self-censoring out of fear of ending up taking enormous financial loss if they're subject to spurious lawsuits over articles that are critical of the activities of the CCP regime here in Canada. So we've got your back, Sam.
Well, thanks for that. And Dean, I believe you've got some questions to roll out, possibly from audience members or more wide-ranging topics.
Sam, thank you. Yes, I do. I'd like to thank the audience today for hanging in there with us for this event. And we have a number of questions. And first is a question I think that could be answered by both Sam and perhaps Teng. Are there any foundations that focus on the issue to protect Canadian or U.S. interests against the threats from the CCP? So, Teng, what do you know about in the U.S.? Are there such groups?
You mean non-governmental organizations?
Yes. Is there any one group that really represents and actually helps to protect U.S. citizens, or maybe the U.S. What's happening in the U.S. legislature, in the House in terms of new laws? Perhaps you might just want to comment on that.
Yeah, of course. Both governmental and non-governmental efforts. In terms of the civil society, there are many journalists and scholars and think tanks are focusing on the issue. They have written a lot of reports and news coverage. So that has been increasing for the past 4 or 5 years, and the American policy. I would say more and more people in the government and the Congress realize the threat from the CCP, and we know that the legislation requires all the CCP medias, not all, but some CCP media, like an agency like China Daily, to register as foreign agents, and then the Magnitsky Act. So some government officials in China have been put on the list of Magnitsky sanctions. Yeah.
Thank you. I think actually that dovetails. It shows us that the U.S. Congress and some of the committees that are associated with examining China's role both on trade, espionage, research, academic information transfer. Here in Canada, the U.S. is starting to take action. So is Australia with their Foreign Agents Registry Act. The U.K. is starting to do some things, but here in Canada, Sam, maybe you could comment on that, because really there seems to be little the Canadian government at this point is doing to protect Canadian interests.
I think that's right. To the first question, there is the Canadian Friends of Hong Kong and the Canada Alliance Hong Kong. These are groups that really are shouldering I'm sure there are some more community groups that are shouldering most of the weight of what, in my view, Ottawa, our leaders, should be doing, and that is making sure that people of every race and all backgrounds in Canada are free to live their democratic lives and not feel that they're surveilled and harassed. And I jumped to one of the chapters of my book, Compromised Nodes, where I discovered that some of the people that were in that building in Vancouver that was surrounded by a mob of people waving giant red flags, people that I discovered were closely associated with elite organized crime targets. Those people inside that building, they told me they were terrified. There were WeChat messages that they later discovered in which people were making comments such as, should we bring bats? Or there were screen pictures of weapons. And what I heard and really bothered me was those people said, no one, not one Canadian politician, we alerted them that we felt that our freedom of expression and religion was suppressed. We feel that our identities were captured, potentially, to be put in some hard drive in the consulate over in Beijing so our family members could be leveraged. And no one had our back, no politicians. That's why I knew that I had to tell that story in this book, both to demonstrate the ties between agents of harassment and agents of organized crime, and to tell the Canadian public that Chinese Canadians, Hong Kong Canadians, Uyghur activists feel that their rights are not being respected equally in Canada. They are not being protected. So, Dean, to jump to your last question, look, I did a story that quoted freely from David Mulrooney, the former ambassador to China for Canada. He's speaking very freely now about this concept of elite capture. Canada, he said, is a sleepy and naive target for very sophisticated foreign interference, mostly, of course, from the number one threat, the PRC, but also, of course, from countries such as Russia, Iran. And the point here is that there's an elite in Ottawa that hasn't moved in the way that Australia has been an exemplar with rigorous foreign interference laws. I know Charles knows very well that when those laws in Australia were brought in, there were some people that were collecting big checks, let's just say more or less under the table from interests from mainland China to talk the China line, and they were getting paid without Australian citizens knowing about it. If Canada had such laws and the ability to prosecute for people that don't disclose those hidden interests, I think perhaps we would see a lot less letters coming out and telling us why the rule of law should be undermined and Huawei's CFO should be sent back post-haste to Beijing, and we should break our rule of law alliances with the allies such as the United States.
May I jump in a very brief example? Yeah, many human rights organizations in the United States and other countries, like SFT, Students for Free Tibet, have done a lot of work to close the Confucius Institute. So in the United States, for the past 4 or 5 years, maybe 40 Confucius Institutes have been shut down. And the government and Congress are also supportive of the idea of shutting down Confucius Institutes. Thank you.
Teng, thank you for that. Actually, Sam brought up another point and sort of gets me to a question actually that's being sent to us by Dr. Clive Hamilton, the author of Hidden Hand, along with Mareki Olberg. And here's the question for you, Sam, from Clive. Do you believe Canada needs a new law criminalizing foreign interference to help break up the influence of the CCP in Canadian political and academic institutions?
The answer is a simple yes. I'm not a lawyer, so I won't write that law myself. But again, I do know that the Parliamentary Security and Intelligence Committee has put Australia forward as an exemplar for the types of laws they've initiated over the past few years. We've just seen some of the more, really sensational investigations in Australia that have come to light over the past year. There was a senator that allegedly tipped off a very high-level United Front figure and whale gambler. Let me just take that chance to say that one of the things I was shocked in my research was how closely Canada's underground casino networks relate to Australia. So let's follow that logically. If we have the same crime model, which is seeking to influence Canadian politicians just as they were seeking to influence Australian politicians, of course Canada needs very similar laws to Australia. And it looks to me like a dereliction of duty when you have the blueprint in front of you in Parliament. Why are the politicians, why is the elected government not acting on those best practices recommendations already?
So that kind of leads into the whole international element. Some of you here on this call today know about an organization called IPAC, the Inter-Parliamentary Alliance for China. It's an organization that I've also been involved with for about 9 months, but Ben Rogers can speak specifically about that as he's an ongoing advisor. Ben, how do you see, nations coming together to actually push for new laws and new legislation to actually collectively work together to combat these kinds of intrusions into our nations by the Chinese Communist Party and their influence using big money to influence the political apparatus?
Yeah, I think that kind of international collaboration is incredibly important, because when countries try to do things, try to take a stand on their own, it's very easy for the CCP to target them, to play them off one another, to play divide and rule. But if the free world can really stand together, both rhetorically, but more importantly with practical steps, then that can make a difference. And I think IPAC is an incredible network. It's been in existence for less than a year, and it already brings together parliamentarians, completely bipartisan, cross-party, politicians from different political parties who wouldn't be on the same page on most other things, but have come together on this issue from more than 20 countries around the world. And I think it's has real potential to, of course, every country's legislature and legislative system is different, and laws need to be tailored for their own particular jurisdiction. But I think IPAC can help mobilize and encourage that kind of multilateral approach.
Thank you, Ben. Sam, did you have any further comment along those lines about gaining traction and international pressure on the Canadian government to enact new laws in this regard?
Not too much comment. Just an example. Such respected persons as Irwin Cotler that come from the party that's presently in government have made those arguments that Canada really needs to recognize that. Probably it's a step behind, I believe, and it does need to be multi-partisan. This is not a partisan issue at all. If it is a partisan issue, that only points to deeper problems.
Indeed. We're going to be concluding in about 7 minutes here. I did want to get a question that actually dovetails on the collaborative efforts, and this is a question for Tom and Ivy. I'd like you to talk to this, and I think it speaks to the various organizations that are currently working for various groups on China-Canada relations and defending Hong Kongers or Uyghurs or Tibetans. And that question for Tom is this: is there a collaborative effort and a coalition that is inclusive of all Canadians and orgs with diverse cultural and ethnicities that are against the encroachment of the CCP in Canada? And is there a new united front forming to challenge China? Ivy?
Well, definitely we have to work together. But I think when we are putting the united front, our united front together, we have to be very careful about choosing the appropriate groups and people in it. And we also have to make it very clear about that. What is the target? What is the goal of it? If the goal is to make sure that we examine everything very thoroughly and critically, then we can avoid having those groups being hijacked, because the CCP is very good at actually hijacking a group that might an alliance or a group that might come starting with genuine and really working well, and then they infiltrate it. So the only way we can avoid that is by making sure we always use a very critical kind of approach of examination. But definitely we need that.
Thank you. And I think at this point, we've gone through a lot of topics. I think we've covered off a lot of ground today, and to provide our audience with really a deep perspective of Sam's work and how it relates to so many of the issues around the globe facing the China diaspora, facing national governments in terms of the infiltration by transnational organized crime, money laundering, which results in gun running, it's narco-terrorism, which is financed. Sam gets into that subject as well. But what I thought I would do at this point is ask Sam to kind of give us some closing remarks and maybe an anecdote or two more, and we'll close off the event after that. So Sam, over to you.
Sure, and I'd say, first of all, thank you so much for the other panelists, both for reading the book and commenting on the book, and being here today to explain really the high-level political issues and some responses we've talked about. And Dean, I would say that I have to hammer this point again and again. This book started really with just the most scandalous casino crime that you can imagine. British Columbia being an absolute brazen outlier. Not even in Macau or Las Vegas could people imagine people walking into a casino with a hockey bag with $1 million in 20s, wrapped in elastic bands, and in some cases with cocaine or fentanyl dust dripping off them. So this started as a super blockbuster crime story. And following it year after year, it became, it got into that espionage story. And I looked at a case where a United Nations official was allegedly, it's not alleged, unfortunately, he's not with us anymore, but he was a target of political corruption from a very sophisticated network that I found was very interrelated with the big players in BC casino money laundering, such as Lai Changxing, the former world's China's most wanted, who, by the way, was running a virtual casino between Richmond, BC Mansion and Macau 20 years ago. People often ask me, where is this money laundering going? What about Bitcoin crypto? I tell them 20 years ago, people like Lai Changxing had virtual casinos borderless running from Richmond mansions. Let me get back to that big UN corruption case. My book with the link charts shows that the people who are involved in a certain industry association are related to a man that was investigated for Sun Yan triad links back in the 1990s. I talk about how the Canadian High Commission allegedly was corrupted in a high-level immigration scam that could have touched the highest levels really of political power in Canada and of course Hong Kong and China. Back to that UN case, we're talking about UN NGO bodies, corruption in New York City, that comes back to that casino money laundering story. We've got $20 million in wire transfers purportedly coming into casinos in Las Vegas, purportedly coming in to buy real estate in New York City. But we learned in that UN case that this money had other purposes. Quote unquote, we can call it threat financing in intelligence speak. That means those money, that it's not just about whale gamblers, it's about cash being used to fund political bribes in the United States. So why, of course that's happening in Canada. We know that it's happening in Australia. So I'm glad that I get a sense already that people are jumping, they're being hooked on this book because of those hockey bags of cash. But what I would tell the viewers is at the end of the day, it's not just about fentanyl overdoses. It's not just about house prices. It is truly about democracy. This casino money laundering, this trade-based money laundering, these Belt and Road projects, they're all interrelated into a system where foreign governments, political leaders, business leaders, academics, bureaucrats will be the targets of influence by these same actors active in the casinos.
Thank you, Sam. And I do have to say, it's been great working with Sam, over the past couple of years. He's worked extremely hard on uncovering some phenomenal stories. And while it sounds like we covered off a great deal of ground today, trust me, we've barely even scratched the surface of this book, maybe 10% of it, really. This is it's such a phenomenal story, from murders to high seas, overtaking of casino ships, to money laundering around the world. It's just an incredible book, as so many people have already commented. And I'd like to thank Sam for his fine work. Also, Terry Glavin, who worked with Sam at the early portions of this book, and all the other people that have helped contribute to this book, the advisors that I've spoken to, including Ben and Ivy and Charles and Tang, about what goes on in China, what goes on with the PRC. In closing, I'd just like to say this. Thank you to also Anders Kaur, who's a good colleague of mine and as the publisher of the Journal of Political Risk in the United States. His great guidance and input has been phenomenal to Optimum and to the publishing of a number of books. You can get your book, by the way, at Chapters in Indigo. You can buy it on Amazon right now. It's sold out, but books have been shipped to Amazon. I just want to let you know, because of COVID, please be patient. People's organizations are running at 50-60% because of COVID protocols. So please be patient with that on that front. Thank you to our producers here today that have helped put this event together. A big thanks to all of our panel experts. This will be rebroadcast tonight at 8 p.m. and Sam Cooper will be on 640 Radio, the Alex Pearson Show tonight, and on Saturday again with Roy Green. It's Saturday afternoon. So if you haven't quite got your fill of Wilful Blindness, by all means follow him, and I'm sure you're going to hear a lot more about this book. Thank you, everyone. Have a great evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.